Deep inside the forests of New Zealand, there is a formation that looks almost impossible to explain. A row of enormous stone blocks appears to form a perfectly organized wall. The strange part is not simply how old these rocks are. It is what some researchers believe they might represent, because if these stones were placed here by humans, then someone may have built them long before the Mo or I arrived. And that would force us to ask a much bigger question. Who was here before them? And why does this strange formation seem to connect with one of the oldest mysteries in human history? At first glance, the Kaimanawa Wall looks like an ancient construction. The stones are large, their surfaces appear unusually flat, and several blocks seem to line up horizontally and vertically, almost as if they were deliberately cut and placed beside one another. That is what made the site famous. In the 1990s, researchers and enthusiasts began arguing that this was not simply a natural rock formation. Some suggested that it could be the remains of a much older structure, hidden beneath the vegetation of the Kaimanawa forest. And once that idea appeared, the story became much bigger than a wall, because New Zealand already had a known human history. So if this was artificial, who built it? The strongest argument was visual. The exposed blocks appear remarkably regular. Some are roughly similar in size. Their joints can look almost perfectly straight from certain angles. And when you stand directly in front of them, the formation can resemble a massive ancient wall. That resemblance became the foundation of the mystery. But there was another claim. If the visible blocks were only the front of a much larger structure, then the hill behind them could potentially represent something far more ambitious. Some even interpreted the shape as the remains of a buried pyramid or monumental construction. There was only one problem. Looking like a wall is not the same thing as being a wall, so investigators had to ask a much harder question. What does the geology actually say? The scientific explanation is far less mysterious. Geologists identified the rock as rangy kiegnumbrite, a volcanic rock formed roughly 330,000 years ago. As hot volcanic material cooled, it contracted. That cooling created fractures through the rock, and under the right conditions, those fractures can produce surprisingly regular blocks. An investigation by geologist Peter Wood concluded that the Kaimanawa Formation was a natural outcrop. Archaeologist Neville Ritchie reached the same general conclusion. Close inspection revealed something important. The joints were not actually as perfect as they appeared from a distance. Some were irregular. The blocks were not all identical, and matching irregularities could be seen on opposing surfaces. In other words, the evidence pointed toward geology rather than ancient masonry. But this is where the story becomes interesting, because even if the Kaimanawa Wall is natural, the mystery that surrounded it reveals something else. People saw a pattern. They saw enormous blocks. They saw geometry, and they immediately connected it to ancient monuments elsewhere in the world. That connection may be wrong, but the question it created is fascinating. Why do so many ancient sites contain enormous stones arranged with astonishing precision? How did ancient people move them? Why did completely different cultures invest so much effort into monumental construction? And could the Kaimanawa Wall have been mistaken for one of those structures simply because natural geology sometimes imitates human engineering? The comparison is difficult to ignore. From Egypt to Peru, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, ancient builders worked with enormous quantities of stone. At places like Sacsayhuaman, massive blocks were shaped and fitted together with remarkable precision. At Giza, enormous stone structures were created thousands of years ago. And across the ancient world, monumental construction appears again and again. None of this proves that the Kaimanawa Formation was built by humans, but it explains why the comparison became so powerful. One strange-looking wall became connected to a much larger question. How much do we really understand about the engineering abilities of ancient people? But the original mystery did not stop with ancient builders. It went much further. If enormous structures were built in the distant past, some theorists asked a much stranger question. What if the builders themselves were enormous? Stories of giants appear in cultures around the world. Ancient Greek mythology described the gigantes. The Hebrew Bible contains references to unusually powerful figures such as the Nephilim, and many later traditions described races of giants, living in a distant age. For believers in the theory, these stories are not random. They are memories. Memories of a time when humans, or something similar to humans, were supposedly much larger than us. But there is a serious problem. A story is not a skeleton, a painting is not a fossil, and a giant statue is not evidence that giants actually existed. But there is one part of this story that is very real. More than a century ago, A man from the Russian Empire became famous across Europe because of his extraordinary height. His name was Feodor Machnow. Photographs show him standing beside ordinary people, and the difference is almost unbelievable. He was reported to have been around 7 feet 10 inches tall, although later claims put his height even higher. That larger figure is disputed, but even the more conservative measurements make Machnow an extraordinary case. He traveled through Europe as a performer, appearing in exhibitions and public events. People came to see him because, at a time before modern medicine and mass media, someone of his size seemed almost impossible. And this is where the story becomes important. Machnow proves something simple. Humans really can reach extraordinary heights. But he was still a human being. His bones were human. His life was documented. And this is exactly where the mystery gets darker. For more than a century, newspapers and magazines have reported discoveries of enormous human skeletons. Some stories claim that the bones belonged to people several meters tall. Others were accompanied by photographs showing researchers standing beside gigantic skeletons. At first glance, these images seem to confirm everything the giant legends promised. But there is a problem. Some of the most famous examples were later exposed as hoaxes, exaggerations, or manipulated images. The famous Cardiff giant, for example, became one of the greatest archaeological hoaxes of the 19th century. And some photographs of supposed giant skeletons that circulate online today have also been digitally manipulated. So now we have two completely different things. A real historical giant like Feodor Machnow, and photographs of supposed ancient giants that cannot survive serious investigation. That distinction matters, because one extraordinary human being is evidence that extreme height is possible. It is not evidence that an ancient race of giant humans once ruled the earth. So where does that leave the Kaimanawa Wall? The strongest scientific evidence says it is natural. The giant skeleton photographs that circulate online are often hoaxes. And there is no accepted archaeological evidence for a lost civilization of enormous human builders in New Zealand. But that does not make the original question meaningless. Maybe the Kaimanawa Wall is simply a remarkable geological accident. Maybe that is the entire story. But it leaves us with something worth remembering. Sometimes nature can create structures that look engineered. Sometimes myths preserve distorted memories of real events. And sometimes extraordinary claims survive because the evidence looks convincing at first glance. The Kaimanawa Wall may not have been built by an ancient civilization,